Marcus woke to the same gray light seeping through the threadbare curtains of his Vermont bedroom, a dull wash that painted the warped floorboards in shades of ash. The wind howled outside, rattling the panes of the old farmhouse like a restless ghost, and he lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar creak of the rafters overhead. 63 years had etched their lines into his hands, his face, his heart, but it was the last 5, since Ruth's passing, that had hollowed him out, leaving a husk of man who moved through his days like a wind-up toy on its last turn. The clock on the nightstand ticked towards 6, its brass hands glinting faintly in the gloom, and he sighed, a sound as worn as the quilt bunched around his knees. Another day to endure. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of stale coffee and damp wood, the kind of scent that clung to a house too long neglected. He shuffled to the stove, his slippers scuffing the linoleum, and set the kettle to boil, its whistle a shrill promise of warmth in a world gone cold. The snow had started overnight, a soft blanket over the fields he'd let go to seed, and as he peered out the fog window, he saw the barn door banging in the gusts. Unlatched again. He muttered a curse under his breath, though there was no one to hear it, and pulled on his coat, the wool stiff with age and faintly sour from years of sweat. The chores wouldn't wait, not even for a man who'd rather crawl back into the silence of his bed. The cold bit at his knuckles as he trudged across the yard, boots crunching through the fresh snow, each step a small rebellion against the ache in his knees. The barn loomed ahead, its red paint peeling like old skin, and he yanked the door open with a grunt, expecting the usual stillness. Hay dust swirling in the dim light, the faint rustle of mice in the rafters. But then he heard it, a thin, trembling bleat, so fragile it might have been the wind playing tricks. Marcus froze, his breath clouding in the chill, and squinted into the shadows. There, in the corner near a pile of moldering straw, was a tiny shape, white as the snow outside, shivering so hard its knobby legs wobbled beneath it. A baby goat, no bigger than a house cat, its eyes wide and glassy with fear. Well, hell, Marcus rasped, his voice rough from disuse, and he took a step closer, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The little thing bleated again, a pitiful sound that tugged at something deep in his chest, something he'd buried under layers of grief and routine. He scanned the barn. No sign of a mother, no tracks in the straw, just this shivering scrap of life left behind like a forgotten chore. His first thought was to leave it, let nature sort out. He had no business taking on strays, not with the farm barely scraping by and his own stores dwindling. But the goat lifted its head, its ears twitching, and let out another weak cry, and Marcus felt a pang, sharp, unbidden, like a splinter under a fingernail. He stood there, wind whistling through the gaps in the walls, snow drifting in to dust his boots, and wrestled with himself. His hands clenched in his pockets, the cold seeping into his bones, and he thought of Ruth, her soft laugh, the way she'd nursed a sickly calf back to health one spring, her hands steady and sure. She'd have scooped this thing up without a second thought. Marcus, though, wasn't Ruth. He was a man who'd let the fields go fallow, who'd stopped mending fences, who'd turned the porch swing into a perch for crows. Yet here he was, staring down at this trembling creature, and something in him refused to walk away. Damn fool, he muttered, to himself or the goat. He wasn't sure, and bent stiffly to scoop it up. It weighed next to nothing, a bundle of damp fur and fragile bones, and it pressed its cold nose into his coat, shivering against his chest. He cursed again, softer this time, and turned back toward the house, the barn door slamming shut behind him. The snow fell thicker now, stinging his cheeks, and as he crossed the yard, the goat's warmth seeped through his layers, a faint pulse against his ribs. He didn't know what he was doing. Not really, just that the emptiness of his days had cracked open, and this small, unasked-for thing had slipped inside. Inside the kitchen, he set the goat on the hearth, its hooves clicking faintly on the stone, and stoked the fire until the flames licked higher, casting a golden glow over the room. The kettle screeched, forgotten, and he silenced it with a clatter, his mind racing. Milk! He had a jar in the fridge, barely enough for his coffee, but it'd do. He rummaged for an old rag, soaked it, and held it to the goat's mouth, watching as it sucked greedily, its eyes half closed in relief. Marcus sank into the chair by the fire, the wood creaking under him, and stared at the little beast, its white coat drying to a soft fluff in the heat. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he murmured, and the goat bleated back, a sound so earnest it almost made him smile. Almost. Outside, the storm raged on, but in that flickering light, something shifted, a whisper of purpose stirring in the dust of a life he'd thought was done. The fire crackled low, spitting embers onto the hearth where the baby goat lay curled in a nest of old towels Marcus had grudgingly fetched from the linen closet. Its breathing had steadied, a soft rhythm that filled the kitchen with something alive, something other than the drip of melting snow from his boots or the groan of the house settling into its bones. He'd named it Clover on a whim, muttering the word as he'd rigged a makeshift pen from a busted crate and some wire. Clover, like the fields Ruth used to dream of replanting, green and sweet in a summer long gone. Now he sat hunched in his chair, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold, watching the little creature sleep. The clock ticked past noon, but time felt unmoored, the day stretching out like a threadbare blanket. Outside, the snow piled higher, sealing him in with this unexpected guest, and Marcus felt the weight of it. Not just the storm, but the responsibility he'd stumbled into. He hadn't asked for this. The farm was a shadow of what it had been when Ruth was alive, the barn half empty, the tractor rusted out back. He'd kept the chickens for eggs and the cow for milk, but even that felt like too much some days, the effort of it scraping against his solitude. Now here was Clover, bleating faintly in her sleep, her tiny hooves twitching as if chasing a dream. He rubbed a hand over his face, the stubble rasping against his palm, and wondered what madness had possessed him to bring her inside. The afternoon wore on, gray light fading to a bruised purple, and Clover woke with a start, her head jerking up as she let out a sharp, insistent cry. Marcus sighed, setting the mug down with a clink, and shuffled to the fridge. The milk jar was nearly empty now, its glass cloudy with age, and he tipped the last of it into a tin cup, warming it over the stove. The smell of it, sweet, faintly grassy, hit him like a memory, Ruth standing at this very spot, humming as she stirred a pot of chowder. He shook his head, banishing the thought, and knelt by the hearth, offering the cup to Clover. She nosed at it clumsily, spilling half the milk down her chin, and he muttered, "Messy little cuss," though there was no heat in it. Her tongue darted out, lapping at his fingers, and the warmth of that small touch jolted him, a spark in the numbness he'd worn like a second skin. He built the pen sturdier that evening, hammering nails into the crate with hands that trembled from cold or disuse. He couldn't tell which. Clover watched, her head tilted, and when he finished, she hopped inside, her legs wobbling but stronger than before. "Stay put," he told her, his voice gruff, and she answered with a bleat that sounded almost indignant. He snorted, a rusty sound, half laugh, half cough, and sank back in his chair, the fire's glow painting shadows across the walls. The house felt different with her in it, less like a tomb and more like a place where something might happen, though he couldn't say what. Sleep came fitfully that night, the wind's howl mingling with Clover's soft noises downstairs. Marcus dreamed of Ruth. Not her last days, frail and fading, but the early ones, her hair catching the sun as she scattered feed for the goats they'd once kept. He woke with a start, chest tight, and lay there in the dark, listening to the storm's last gasps. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving a hush over the world, and he found Clover standing in her pen, nibbling at the edge of his coat where it hung over the chair. "Your trouble," he grumbled, but he scratched her head anyway, her fur soft under his calloused fingers, and felt a flicker of something. Amusement, maybe, or the ghost of a smile. He spent the day tending to her, rigging a bottle from an old rubber glove and some tubing he found in the shed, muttering to himself about the foolishness of it all. Clover followed him as he moved around the kitchen, her hooves tapping a clumsy rhythm, and when she butted her head against his shin, demanding attention, he caught himself talking back. "Pushy, aren't you?" he said, And then, softer, "Ruth would have liked you." The words slipped out, unguarded, and he froze, the ache of her name sharp in his throat. He turned away, busying himself with the fire, but Clover bleated, insistent, and he relented, scooping her up to sit by the hearth. She nestled against him, her warmth seeping into his side, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so heavy. That night, as the fire died to embers, Marcus looked out at the fields, blanketed in white, and thought of the seed packets tucked in the pantry. Clover, alfalfa, things he'd meant to plant but never did. His hands itched, restless, and he glanced at Clover, asleep in her pen, her chest rising and falling. "Guess we'll need something to eat," he murmured, and the words hung in the air, a quiet vow. The farm wasn't dead yet, and neither was he, not quite. The thought settled over him like the snow outside, cold but softening, and he leaned back in his chair, letting the possibility take root. The days began to blur into a rhythm Marcus hadn't known since Ruth's laughter filled the farmhouse, a cadence shaped by Clover's insistent bleats and the slow thaw of winter into a muddy, tentative spring. Mornings now started with her nudging his hand as he stirred oatmeal on the stove, her white coat flecked with straw from her pen, her eyes bright with a hunger that mirrored his own, a hunger he hadn't named until now. The snow had retreated, leaving the fields sodden and glistening, and he found himself staring out the kitchen window longer each day. The expanse of earth no longer just a graveyard of neglect, but a canvas, blank and waiting. Clover had done that. Somehow, this scrappy little goat with her clumsy leaps and nibbling teeth, tugging him out of the shadows one bleat at a time. He started small, clearing a patch near the barn where the soil wasn't too rocky, his boots sinking into the muck as he swung the hoe. The first swing jarred his shoulders, a dull ache blooming in his joints, and he cursed under his breath, half ready to quit. But Clover was there, tethered to a post with an old rope, hopping after a butterfly that danced just out of reach, and her antics pulled a grunt of amusement from him. "Fool thing," he muttered, and kept going, the earth yielding under his hands, dark and rich with promise. He planted Clover's seed first, fitting, he thought, with a wry twist of his mouth, and then alfalfa, the motions coming back to him like a song he'd forgotten the words to but not the tune. His palms blistered, his back groaned, but there was a warmth in it, a quiet ache that felt more like living than anything had in years. Clover followed him everywhere now, her legs sturdier with each passing week, her bleats less desperate and more demanding. She'd nibble at his coat hem as he worked, or put her head against his knee when he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, and he'd grumble, "Get on, you pest," though his tone softened each time. He talked to her more than he meant to, about the weather, the soil, the way the clouds piled up like cotton over the hills. And then, one afternoon, as he knelt to pull a weed, he caught himself saying, "Ruth always said you got to give the roots room to breathe." And the words hung there, heavy and real. He sat back on his heels, the damp earth soaking through his jeans, and let the memory settle. Not a knife this time, but a thread, stitching something back together. The neighbor, Tom, showed up one crisp morning, his pickup rattling down the lane with a cloud of dust. Marcus was in the yard, Clover tugging at a tuft of grass, when Tom leaned out the window, squinting at the goat. "Heard you'd taken an astray," he called, his voice gravelly with years of pipe smoke. "Didn't figure you for the type." Marcus shrugged, brushing dirt from his hands. "Didn't figure it myself." Tom climbed out, a wiry man with a limp, and crouched to scratch Clover's ears, chuckling as she nibbled his sleeve. "She's a spitfire. Got any milk to spare? I trade you some cheese. Goat's milk stuff sharp as hell." Marcus hesitated, the old instinct to hoard what little he had flaring up, but Clover bleated, as if casting a vote, and he nodded. "Reckon I could manage that." The trade became a weekly thing. Tom's cheese for Clover's milk, which Marcus learned to coax with a patience he didn't know he had. His hands, stiff and uncertain at first, found a rhythm, the warm stream hissing into a tin pail while Clover stood still, chewing cud like she was doing him a favor. The cheese was good, tangy, crumbly, better than anything he'd tasted in years, and he ate it with bread by the fire. Clover sprawled at his feet, her head resting on his boot. He started leaving the gate open when Tom came, and soon other neighbors trickled by, drawn by whispers of the goat and the man who'd started tending his fields again. They brought jam, eggs, stories, and Marcus found himself nodding along, his replies short but less guarded, the edges of his solitude fraying. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the hills in streaks of gold, he sat on the porch with Clover beside him, her head in his lap. The air smelled of wet earth and budding green, and he ran a hand over her back, her fur soft and warm under his fingers. "You're a damn nuisance," he said, but his voice cracked, and he swallowed hard, the ache in his chest not grief this time, but something lighter, something alive. The field stretched out before him, patchy still, but sprouting, and he thought of Ruth, not with the old despair, but with a quiet wish she could see this, see him trying. Clover bleated, soft and content, and Marcus let his hand rest there, the weight of her grounding him to this new, fragile rhythm, a life he hadn't planned, but one he was starting to claim. Spring unfurled over the Vermont hills like a slow breath, the air turning sweet with lilac and the hum of bees, and Marcus's homestead began to pulse with a life he'd thought long extinguished. The field sprouted uneven patches of green, clover and alfalfa pushing through the soil he'd coaxed back to purpose, and Clover, now a sturdy little shadow at his side, grazed with a vigor that matched the sun's climb. Her bleats had grown bolder, a brassy chorus that greeted him each morning as he stumbled from bed, the creak of the stairs under his boots blending with her calls. He'd mutter, "Hush, you'll wake the dead," but the corner of his mouth would twitch, betraying the warmth that had taken root in him, stubborn as the weeds he'd once let choke the land. The farm stand started small, a rickety table by the lane, cobbled from barnwood and nails he'd scavenged from the shed, topped with a sign that read "Goat Milk and Cheese" in a shaky scrawl. Tom's trades had sparked the idea, and soon the locals came, their pickups and rusty sedans kicking up dust as they parked to gawk at Clover, who'd prance and leap like a circus act, nibbling at their shoelaces. "She's a character," they'd say, and Marcus would nod, hands stuffed in his pockets, unsure what to do with the attention, but feeling it settle over him like a worn coat, comfortable, if a little strange. They bought the milk, the cheese, sometimes a jar of jam from a neighbor's surplus, and left with smiles that lingered in his mind long after the dust settled. One Saturday, as the sun hung low and golden, a woman lingered by the stand, her flour-dusted apron tied over a faded dress, her hair streaked with gray and caught in a loose bun. She carried a basket of bread, crusty loaves that smelled of yeast and warmth, and set it down with a shy smile. "I'm Ellen," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Baked down at the co-op. Thought you might like these. Heard you got a knack with that goat." Clover, as if on cue, butted her head against Ellen's shin, and Marcus felt a flush creep up his neck. "She's a menace," he said, but Ellen laughed, a sound like wind chimes on a breezy day, and crouched to scratch Clover's ears. "She's sweet. Takes after you, maybe." He froze, the words catching him off guard, but Ellen's eyes crinkled with a kindness that didn't demand reply. She straightened, brushing flour from her hands, and added, "I'll trade you bread for some of that cheese." "Deal." Marcus nodded, fumbling as he handed her a wedge wrapped in wax paper, and she pressed a loaf into his arms, its crust still warm. "See you next week," she said, and walked off, leaving him standing there, the bread's heat seeping through his coat, Clover bleeding as if to say, "Well, go on then." The next week, she came back, and the week after that, her visits stitching themselves into his days like a quiet thread. They'd talk, sparse at first, about the weather, the bread, Clover's latest mischief, but it deepened, the words unfurling like the spring around them. She told him about her late husband, lost to a heart attack years back, and he found himself mentioning Ruth, the name slipping out softer now, less jagged. One afternoon, as Clover chased a grasshopper between them, Ellen laughed, a full, bright sound, and Marcus joined her, the rumble of it startling him, like a muscle waking after a long sleep. "You've got a good laugh," she said, and he ducked his head, muttering, "Been a while," but the glow of it stayed with him, an ember he didn't douse. The stand grew busier, a small crowd gathering each weekend, and Marcus learned their names, Tom with his cheese, Sarah with her jams, old Mr. Hale with his stories of the war. Clover was the star, her antics drawing them in. But it was Marcus they stayed for, his gruff nods turning to greetings, his hands steadier as he poured milk or weighed cheese. Ellen started bringing scones, then pies, and he'd save a slice for himself, eating it by the fire with Clover at his feet, the sweetness a balm to the bitterness he'd carried so long. He caught himself watching her sometimes, the way her hands moved sure and gentle, and felt a pull, a longing he hadn't dared name since Ruth, fragile but growing. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and the crickets began their song, Ellen stayed late, helping him pack up the stand. Clover dozed by the table, her head on Marcus's boot, and Ellen brushed a strand of hair from her face, her breath clouding in the cool air. "You've built something here," she said, her voice low. "Didn't think I would," he admitted, and she smiled, soft and knowing. "Sometimes it sneaks up on you." She touched his arm, a fleeting warmth, and walked off into the dusk, leaving him with the echo of her words and the weight of Clover against his leg. He stood there, the night folding around him, and felt the ripple of it all, the stand, the people, Ellen, spreading through his life, pulling him towards something he hadn't known he could still reach for. Summer draped the Vermont hills in a haze of green and gold, the air thick with the scent of cut hay and the drone of cicadas, and Marcus's homestead hummed with a vitality that felt like a second chance. The fields, once a tangle of neglect, now rolled out in neat rows of clover and alfalfa, their leaves catching the sun like a promise kept. Clover, no longer a trembling waif, but a sturdy companion with a coat that gleamed white against the earth, grazed beside him as he worked, her bell jangling with each step. The farm stand had grown too, a proper stall now, with a slanted roof and shelf for Ellen's pies, Tom's cheese, Sarah's jams, drawing folks from town and beyond, their voices a soft current through his days. Marcus moved among them, slower than he'd once been but sure, his hands steady as he poured milk or weighed goods, his gruff hellos softened by a warmth he no longer fought. Morning started early, the sky still pink when he'd shuffle to the kitchen, Clover bleeding at the door until he let her in to nibble crumbs from the floor. He'd brew coffee, the rich smell mingling with the yeast of Ellen's bread, left from her last visit, and sit by the window, watching the world wake. The routine was his now, not a burden but a tether, and Clover was its heart, her headbutts and playful leaps a daily nudge to keep going. He'd talk to her still about the crops, the weather, the way the light hit the hills, and sometimes about Ruth, her memory a quiet presence he could hold without breaking. She'd have loved this, he'd murmur, scratching Clover's ears, and the goat would bleat back, as if agreeing, her warmth against his leg a balm to the years he'd lost. Ellen was a constant now, her laughter a thread woven into the fabric of his life. She'd come midweek too, not just Saturdays, her apron dusted with flour, as she dropped off scones or stayed to help at the stand. They worked side by side, her hands brushing his as they passed jars or pies, and he'd catch himself lingering in those moments, the touch igniting a spark he hadn't felt since youth. One evening, as the sun sank low and the crickets took up their song, she stayed after the crowd had gone, sitting with him on the porch. Clover sprawled between them, chewing a blade of grass, and Ellen leaned back, her shoulder close to his. "You've done good, Marcus," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her, the lines of her face softened by dusk, and managed couldn't have alone. She smiled, a quiet thing, and rested her hand on his, the warmth of it steadying him like Clover's weight ever had. The farm thrived. Milk and cheese sold steady. The fields yielded enough to feed Clover and barter for seed, and the stand became a hub, a place where stories swapped hands as often as goods. Marcus found himself at its center, not just a vendor, but a man they knew, one who'd nod at their tales and offer a rare, dry quip that drew laughs. He'd catch Ellen watching him sometimes, her eyes bright with something he'd dare to call fondness, and feel his chest tighten, not with grief, but with a hope he hadn't known he could still harbor. One night, as they sat by the fire, Clover dozing at their feet, she said, "You're different now." And he nodded, the words too big to speak. Because of her, because of you. By late summer, the days shortened, the air cooling as the hills flared red and orange, and Marcus stood in the field one evening, Clover aside. The stand was packed away, the last customers gone, and he looked out at the land, his land alive again, and felt the weight of it settle, not heavy but right. Ellen's truck rumbled up the lane, her headlights cutting the dusk, and she stepped out, a pie in her hands, her smile a beacon. "Apple," she called, and he met her halfway, Clover trotting behind. They sat on the porch as the stars pricked the sky, sharing slices, the tart sweetness bursting on his tongue, and Clover nudged his knee, begging a crumb. He laughed, a full, free sound, and Ellen joined him, their voices mingling in the night. This was his new normal. The farm breathing, Clover's steady presence, Ellen's quiet companionship. No grand declarations, no sweeping change, just small acts of courage, of staying, of caring, rippling out to remake a life he'd thought finished. He reached for Ellen's hand, tentative but sure, and she squeezed back, the warmth of it a quiet triumph. Clover bleated, soft and content, and Marcus leaned into the moment, the ache of the past a distant echo, drowned by the gentle hum of now. And so Marcus's story closes, not with a bang, but with the soft glow of a life reclaimed, one bleat, one pie, one touch at a time. It's a tale of quiet hope, of how the smallest creatures can stir the deepest roots, and I hope it's left you with a warmth that lingers. If you've enjoyed this journey, subscribe below so you don't miss the next story. More hearts, more hills, and maybe a few more stubborn goats await.